Hey guys, before you get into the video, I just wanted to let you know that just last week I was on a podcast called The First Podcast, and we got to talk about a lot of nerd stuff, and I was able to share with the guys kind of my love and interest of D&D and tabletop role-playing games in general. So, I'm going to leave a link in the description below. Go show that podcast a little bit of love, let them know I sent you, and thanks for watching. Now, we're going to get into the video. So there are tons of subgenres to the fantasy genre, and with tabletop role-playing games, you can experience pretty much all of them. So let's talk about a few. Hey fellow Game Masters, welcome back to the channel. I'm Richard Quinder, and originally I was going to talk about all the subgenres of fantasy. And then I did some more research, and so today you're only getting about 4, because there's more than I can realistically do in one video. There's a lot of different subgenres, all with different tropes, different ways they work, and different, assets that create that genre. But today we're talking about 4 of kind of the bigger ones that everyone knows a little bit about. First up on the list is dark fantasy. Now this dark fantasy is generally a horror kind of genre that it mixes with fantasy. It's defined as a story that uses horror elements in a fantastical, non-realistic world, so in a fantasy setting. Good examples of this are things like the Frankenstein's monster, the Dracula stories, the werewolves, these kind of classic monsters that don't take place in modern times, but they take place in, other places or things that may or may not have existed at some point in time, and they're just a dark story with a lot of horror elements to them. The dark fantasy genre is a very broad spectrum, though, because it can be defined as a lot of different things. Like, term horror can run this full spectrum, and so all that is also included in the dark fantasy genre. A perfect example of a role-playing game that uses this dark fantasy is on Geek and Sundry's Project Alpha. They ran the Dread series with Ivan Van Norman, who did a fantastic job of making my skin crawl and feel creeped out by watching other people play a role-playing game. It was a great, very well done show. 2 seasons I think they already did. Fantastic example of a dark fantasy. The settings were more of a contemporary setting, but you could also tell this was not a real place. This is, it's not, upstate New York or something, but it is definitely a fantasy kind of setting. Very cool stuff. Check it out when you get a chance on Project Alpha. If you want to use dark fantasy in your own role-playing games, it doesn't take a whole lot of effort to kind of twist a setting around to experience the darkness and the horror of a setting. Most settings are kind of creepy and kind of weird. When you really break them down, there's a lot of scary, dark things. When you're dealing with the classic D&D setting, there's a lot of undead creatures, there's necromancers, there's liches, there's all these things that are basically things right out of horror stories that can come to life. If you wanted to play a game based more on the Lovecraft horror of Cthulhu and those kind of the elder monsters and elder gods, whatever, I'm not too familiar with that. Specifically, I know they exist, but I know that is kind of a dark fantasy genre in itself, so you could pick up those books and read it and learn it. Or you can take pretty much any role-playing game system and twist it to be more dark and more scary. The story building is all up with you at the table, so you don't have to follow the books exactly. Like if you are playing a pre-made adventure and it says goblins, just put in a zombie in there. That's dark fantasy. Make the villain something bigger and badder and scarier with very strong magical powers that we don't understand, something like that, and just try to keep the tone at a very dark, ominous kind of tone throughout the game, and you basically got a dark fantasy. I'm not a big horror fan myself. Personally, when it comes to stories and things, I'm not huge on them, so I can't give really good advice on running a dark fantasy story. But I do know it's not crazy difficult, and if you want something that's pre-made, you could pick up the D&D adventure that is The Curse of Strahd, which takes place in a world called Ravenloft, which is kind of a gothic horror. Similar, it's basically a Dracula story in Dungeons and Dragons terminology and world, and it can give you a lot of ideas of how to bring horror into your own game by playing that or by reading that book. So that's something I would suggest if you want to get into dark fantasy. Next up on my list is my personal favorite, is the high fantasy. Now this is the classic fantasy adventure. You will hear me multiple times on this channel refer to Lord of the Rings, Lord of the Rings, Lord of the Rings, and this is high fantasy. High fantasy is defined as an epic struggle between good and evil between, the light and the darkness, and it spans over continents, over a whole world, where there's the heroes are heroes and the villains are villains, and it is a big clash between good and evil. Most often in a high fantasy, there is magic of some sort. It doesn't have to be as prominent, but it exists, and it's, accepted in the world that magic is there. It might just be used by a couple small people, wizards and such, but it's still there and it's known to exist. In these high fantasy stories, the heroes are heroes. They don't always have to start as heroes, but eventually they get to the point where they are the heroes. They are the big heroes, morally straight. They are on their path, and that is their life. They are defeating evil. The villains in these kind of high fantasies are often referred to as a Dark Lord of some sort. Good ideas of this are like Sauron from Lord of the Rings, or Skeletor, or Voldemort, or Ganon. All these different, villains that are very powerful. They have a lot of magic. They have a vast army at their disposal. They have a lot that the hero is overwhelmed by the amount of power that this villain has. The hero is often not alone. It's a situation where the whole world is threatened by the power that this villain has. And you can see it in tons of fantasy. It's probably the most popular subgenre of fantasy is the high fantasy stories. The cousin of high fantasy is the low fantasy, the next subgenre, which is most popular in Game of Thrones. Now, the Game of Thrones television show, or the Song of Ice and Fire novels, instead of looking at the big picture and the huge world and the big conflict between good and evil, you kind of dig down a little deeper into the real gritty streets of the real people in the world. Magic is less involved in these situations. There might be some magic. There might be, an artifact or something that has magical properties or magical powers, but it is not as commonplace as it would be in a high fantasy situation. If you wanted to play a high fantasy or low fantasy, you basically have the two options. Most D&D and Pathfinder already kind of takes place in a high fantasy environment where magic is very common and everyone has access to that, and the villains are big bad evil genius villains, and you have that. If you wanted to go to low fantasy, you could restrict the amount of magic in your world. It's simple as talking to your players and saying, hey, we want to run this as kind of a low fantasy setting, so less magic, maybe one spellcaster in the party who has limited magic powers. That's possible. You have the control as the game master to do this, and imagine the impact if you're running a game. This is the cool idea that I actually want to do. If you run a game with no magic, if you just have all melee characters, you could maybe have some, paladins. It's hard to move away from magic in 5th edition D&D, but you could figure out a way to do that. Make a game where there's basically no magic, and then you have one magic item that makes the big epic quest that these people have to go on is finding the magic item. They don't have to save the world, they can just be in a town, and I think it's just an interesting idea to get a look at the people who aren't controlling everything and just get in to the basics. If they find a magic item and then that changes their world a little bit and changes their world view, it's kind of neat. I like that idea. Maybe I'll try later on. The game I'm running right now is more of a high fantasy where it's very much in your face magic all the time and a big epic struggle between good and evil. So that's high fantasy and low fantasy, which are two very good genres. And the last one I'm going to talk about today is sword and sorcery. Now, sword and sorcery has been around. It is also a cousin of high fantasy because it is very much built in the idea of magic is a common thing. Or, maybe I won't say common, but magic has its place in the world, and the struggle between good and evil is definitely apparent. But sometimes in sword and sorcery, what you see is a lot more gritty, violent, darker kind of side of things, where the hero might be more morally ambiguous. He might not be the stalwart, lawful good kind of character, but he might be a little more chaotic, a little more leaning towards the evil side, but he might have a vendetta against the evil Dark Lord. So, and that's apparent in the Conan story. Conan the Barbarian, his whole family and village was killed by this evil wizard guy. I have watched it twice. Not super familiar with it, but there is someone who is vastly more powerful, who has magics and an army, and Conan is out for revenge, basically. He wants to kill this guy because of what he's done to his family in the past. And Conan himself, the character, is not the most stalwart, morally upright character in the story. He is, gritty, and he's violent, and he kills things, and, he wants to drive his enemies before him and hear the lamentations of their women. He's not necessarily a good guy, but he's the good guy. He's the hero of the story, the protagonist, and we follow him. Another property of Sword and Sorcery is the stark contrast between the action, like violent weaponry fighting, and the actual magic. It is kind of a more clear divide that doesn't always blend together, where it's like this is a melee fighter, a fighter person is a fighter, and the classes are very strict. It's like in Conan, you have Conan is the barbarian, he's the warrior, you have the rogue, but you have kind of a very clear structure to the classes or to the characters you run, which also works well in a fantasy role-playing situation because everyone's in those classes already. For running a Sword and Sorcery type game, I think you would want to lean heavily into the violence and the action aspect of it. Have a lot of combat in there, make the world very dangerous and dark for the players, make it so their enemies are vastly outnumbered by their enemies and the forces, but they are going at it, and give them room to be a little morally ambiguous. I know I mentioned in early videos about having things that are taboo, and you still want to have taboo subject matter at the table, but when the players want to be murder hobos, that might fit into your story. It might fit that they just go kill everything in order to get to the bad guy. It's kind of like the ends justify the means in this situation. But it really depends on you and your players how you want to play that and how you want to include that in your game. I know this was a very quick rundown, this is a short video, but still you get an idea of several of the genres and how you can see a little difference in each subgenre of fantasy. You can also do the same for science fiction, and maybe I'll do that later, or science fantasy as I like to call it sometimes. But I hope this has helped in planning your game. Like, if you want to not be the basic D&D or the basic Pathfinder genre of like high fantasy, you can change it up and you can make it a horror, you can make it a low fantasy, you can make it Sword and Sorcery, you can make it like an urban fantasy, you can do whatever you want. You have the freedom, and understanding the genres and understanding what comes with each kind of type of story is the first step towards taking that and making these games your own. So I hope this has helped. Thank you for watching the video. If you like the videos, please hit the subscribe button. And if you don't like the videos, I'm sorry. I've been Richard Quiner, and again, thank you for watching.